Well, welcome along to another edition of Unbelievable here on the Unbelievable YouTube channel, but also available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. You can follow the show by liking and subscribing to today's video. And you can also find more from the show at our website, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. And there are links in today's video to our newsletter. We'll even send you a free ebook if you sign up. And if you're watching from the US, get brilliant resources, exclusive stuff via our brand new US-based website, unbelievable.show. Well, today on the show, we're talking about JRR Tolkien, Jesus and the Lord of the Rings. JRR Tolkien, of course, was really the father of modern fantasy adventure writing. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings became classics after they were published. And they've, of course, become blockbuster films as well. Tolkien was an Oxford Don, a professor of English language and literature, and part of the Inklings, of course, a group of friends who met to discuss their latest books and ideas. It included C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and Owen Barfield. But not that many of Tolkien's readers, or those who have watched the films, would necessarily have been aware of Tolkien's devout Catholic faith, and fewer still perhaps how that faith informed the world he created in his books. But two Christian scholars have recently published books tracing the themes and influences in Tolkien's work. Michael Jahosky is the author of the recently published book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth, in which he argues that Tolkien intended his famous work to be a parable. Michael is assistant professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. Holly Ordway returns to the show. She's the author of the soon-to-be published Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, which sheds new light on the modern literary influences on Tolkien, which have often been overlooked in academic work on him. And Holly is a fellow of faith and culture at the Word on Fire Institute. I'll make sure there are links to both of my guests and their books from today's show. But Holly and Michael, welcome along to today's show.
Well, thank you for having us on. This is a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's great to have you both on. Holly, it's been a little while since you were on the show, but since Michael is the complete newcomer to the show, let's start with yourself, Michael. Tell us a little bit about, well, both the book, but maybe first, where you first bumped into Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings specifically.
Yes. So thank you again, Justin, for having me on. In the preface of my book, I tell my personal story. So like many people, I discovered Tolkien slightly before the films came out. I'm going to date myself here and say that it's 16 in 2001. A few months before the movie, I think The Fellowship came out in December, my brother, Chris, started to read me the books and get interested. And we didn't finish them in time before the first film, but we did get pretty underway through The Fellowship. We finished everything after I read The Silmarillion and The Hobbit and kind of made it a annual ritual for me from then on out. And around the same time, my mom had just recently, a few years before that, got in a car accident. She had kind of rediscovered her faith. We were raised Catholic, kind of cradle Catholics. And so what I didn't realize until many years later is that this really was a very providential occurrence, discovering Tolkien and myself kind of taking a renewed interest in my faith, and not necessarily Catholicism or Protestantism at that time, just kind of, what is it all about? And some years passed, and I think around 2011 or so, Simply Jesus, N.T. Wright's book, one of his popular books, came out, and I read it and I said, this sounds really familiar to me, this language about God becoming king. And I looked back and kind of found myself making connections between the gospel and the Bible and the Lord of the Rings. And so Tolkien has been a part of my Christian journey, and I'm grateful. But a lot of the things that I've written about in this book haven't really dawned on me until quite recently. I'd say in the last 5 to 10 years, gradually. So it's been quite a trip writing the book to kind of unpack it all for myself. So.
Well, we'll talk a little more later about your own journey of faith that's gone alongside this growing understanding of literature and Tolkien and theology and so on. Holly, welcome back to the show. We've, of course, heard your story before of the way that Christian literature, poetry really was the way in which you encountered Christianity and came to a faith yourself. But for those who haven't heard that story, but would you just recap it briefly and sort of what that journey looked like for you? Going back, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so now?
Oh, well, it would be, yeah. I mean, it depends where you start, because as you noted, the fantasy literature has been a really important part of my journey. I was not brought up in a religious home at all, not anti-Christian, but also not religious at all. So I was really not exposed to even the basic ideas of Christianity. And it was not surprising then that when I went off to college and was put into a more thoroughly secular atheist environment, I became a thoroughgoing atheist and ended up only really challenging that and reconsidering that in my early 30s. But what was it that brought me to the point where I was willing to look at these arguments? And when I thought about that, when I was writing my memoir, traced it back to my early experience with fantasy literature, because I had grown up steeped in reading C.S. Lewis, from folklore, fairy tales, and Tolkien played such an important part, because I can't even remember quite when I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings for the first time. I can only remember rereading them. So they were part of my imaginative landscape very early on. And so I had a kind of picture of the good, the true, the beautiful, that I had no idea had any connection to Christianity. Really until I was in my 20s, I discovered that C.S. Lewis was writing about Jesus, and I became quite angry with him for a bit until I realized that, oh, well, it's all right. He can have those little views. Very condescending of me at the time. Then when I did my PhD dissertation, I did it on the history of the modern fantasy novel, obviously had to deal with Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. And I was an atheist at the time, but this brought me back into contact with the fact that he and Lewis were authors whom I loved and admired and respected as thinkers, as authors. And this reminded me in a sense that there are a lot of really great writers who believe this stuff. And it eventually prompted me years after that to start thinking, well, what did they believe? And, just to understand better what they thought. And then it became apparent to me that it was actually true, and I was going to have to do something about that, and hence becoming a Christian. But I also want to say just briefly that I owe a double debt to Tolkien. I've been really engaged with Tolkien as a literary critic for, and this will date me, more than 30 years. Because when I was a teenager, I came across a battered copy of the Tolkien Reader, this collection of essays and short pieces that include his great essay on fairy stories. And in it, he presents his argument for the nature of fantasy. He also has an epilogue and a close to it that puts the gospel forward in a really powerful way. And so that really, to that essay, I owe a twofold debt, because I was so moved by that brief presentation of the gospel, even though at the time it wouldn't be for another 20 years or so that I would even begin to consider whether it was true. But that was genuinely the first time that I heard the gospel was in Tolkien's essay. But also that essay, I would say, made me a literary critic. So that's why now here in 2020, as we record this, I have just, written a literary critical study of Tolkien and his influences. Because back, when I was 14 or so, and I read that essay, he was showing me what it meant to be thoughtfully examining literature in a way that was appreciative and not destructive. And I think that really set the path for me in terms of how to engage with literature. So I really owe this twofold debt to Tolkien.
Wonderful stuff. Wonderful. Just for the benefit of those watching on video, really. And so if you're listening by podcast and you want the full experience, you'll have to go to the YouTube channel for this. I have, from my bookshelf, got some beautiful illustrated editions here of The Hobbit, illustrated by Jemima Catlin, and The Lord of the Rings, illustrated by Alan Lee. And when I showed you this before we started recording, you recognized this particular edition, didn't you, Holly? Is that, I'm no Tolkien expert, and these books don't belong to me. They belong to my brother-in-law, who is a huge sort of literary fan and a great fan of fantasy literature and so on. Tell us a bit about this particular one, Holly.
Well, Alan Lee is one of several highly regarded Tolkien illustrators, and he's personally my favorite. After Tolkien himself, Tolkien did art for The Hobbit, which is just splendid. Didn't do any for The Lord of the Rings, though, except for some details inside. But Alan Lee is going to be most familiar probably to your audience because it's his design and vision that was the basis for the films. So there's that ethos, and I think he captures it very well.
Yeah. Well, they are some beautiful. I mention those because they've been on my bookshelf for ages. My brother-in-law has left quite a few of his large book collection in our house over the years. But I did read The Lord of the Rings at around the time the first film came out, and I was actually on my gap year. Just I haven't got married to my wife Lucy, and I read it while in Namibia of all places. But it was a long time ago, 20 years ago, that I read that book. So you'll have to fill in some of the gaps, both of you, for me as we talk through Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, the various influences on his writing, and so on. Let's start with you on this, Michael. So what do you think you've uncovered that maybe other people haven't seen then in Tolkien's books, especially Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit?
Well, so I think two things really. I'm not an expert, a literary expert with allegory and parable, but I feel that I have I've brushed up on my chops the last few years. My understanding is that a great portion of academics, Tolkien academics, are, wanting to shy away from associating Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as an allegory. But in my research, I actually discovered that through the eyes of other Tolkien scholars and in Tolkien's own letters, for those of you that are not aware, Humphrey Carpenter edited a collection of his letters that are very helpful. He refers to the Lord of the Rings as one kind of allegory, but not another. And so, in fact, he makes a distinction between two different kinds of allegory and doesn't really do much explaining. I don't think he really needed to. So it's a blessing that we have that as it is. So after a lot of research and poring through many works, of which I would love to recommend, Holly's book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, was very helpful to me. I'm excited about her new book as well, that I think was critical in unlocking some things that I found. So I think one thing, I would hardly say that I've resolved the issue of allegory, but I do feel, and based on the reviews that have come out on the book already, that I have advanced some knowledge about a better way to understand it. So I've presented Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as and this is not my language, but Sally McFaig some years ago referred to it as a parabolic novel. We can just say briefly, that it's a parable. That itself is going to set off some questions for a lot of listeners and viewers, and there's a lot of confusion about these terms: parable, metaphor, allegory. Allegorical even, has different meaning. And so I unpack it in my book, but what I wish to really advance as far as Tolkien studies is that the way that Tolkien communicated the Christian vision of reality was very important to him. And he wanted to do this in a way that didn't violate his cordial dislike of one kind of allegory, but he admits in several places, or at least one or two places, I should say, that it's impossible to avoid allegorical language because everything is an allegory. All language is an allegory. And so I think it's worth kind of digging into that at some point, getting into that. And so I would say, yes, it's a type of allegory, but as Joseph Pierce has already pointed out, parable could be understood as a subset of allegory. And it could be vice versa, depending on who you talk to. So it does get a little murky, but I think the way I presented it as a parable, the way it reflects truth, conforms to Robert Murray, who was a friend of Tolkien's from the 1940s onward, who he writes to. He wrote an essay in 1992. It was a sermon that he gave actually first, called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And I think that presenting and unpacking what that entails, what Tolkien's Art of the Parable is really what a great chunk of my book is out to do.
Yeah.
And then secondly, just real quick, I'll say, the second thing I set out to do is to correct some of the theological misunderstandings of Christianity. And N.T. Wright was a huge help here, as I've leaned heavily on, I guess you could say, Anglicanism here. But, his understanding, like many scholars, of the already not yet, the holistic story of a new heaven and a new earth, I feel was Tolkien's vision. I think it aligns with his Catholic vision of things. I think Holly's pointed out in her book that, Catholics don't stand by a disembodied eschatology. And so I think it fits nicely. And I think that some scholars have pointed out, I remember Matthew Dickerson wrote a book on Tolkien and said, oh, well, the reason The Lord of the Rings is such a sad story is because the incarnation isn't present. And I disagree. I think finding out how it's present while still respecting Tolkien's wishes on how that was presented was part of the fun. And I do think that it's sad, not because the incarnation hasn't come yet, but because even in spite of the incarnation, like in our own world, Jesus, hasn't erased his imagers. We still have work to do. Tolkien says this in the epilogue on fairy stories. The Christian still has to work and die, but he knows that his work is not in vain. So I don't think it's a sad story because God isn't present there. I think it is sad because it's a realistic story. Life is sad. So
yeah. Holly, we'll hear your responses to some of those broad themes that Michael's bringing out from his own book. Tell us a little bit about your book, your forthcoming book. It's very soon to be published, because I think again you have done some really interesting work in Tolkien scholarship here, uncovering some of the modern literary influences upon Tolkien, which many people I think have sort of believed, well, Tolkien was only ever interested in the past and the great works of literature from the past, but not quite true, you say.
Right, and that's an interesting question to explore, because I myself used to think that very thing. And what I discovered is that his first biographer, and as Michael noted, the editor of the only volume of letters that we have, Humphrey Carpenter, really set a certain tone about dealing with Tolkien. And one of the things that I've discovered is that Carpenter, who was himself an atheist, who had, as it turns out, some issues with the whole idea of Tolkien and medieval literature and fantasy and all of these things, he had certain views that he puts into his biography, his group biography, The Inklings, and of the letters. He says that in the biography that Tolkien read very little modern fiction and took no serious note of it. He asserts that. And not unreasonably, generations of critics have taken him at his word, because he is, as to this point, the only authorized biographer of Tolkien. He's the only one who's had access to the materials, all the materials of Tolkien's papers. It was reasonable to accept that. But when I started investigating about 10 years ago, I started asking myself the question, where did the Lord of the Rings come from? And from my previous research, I knew that there was a tradition of fantasy literature that predated Tolkien. And I became interested in the question of what of that literature had Tolkien read? How did that shape his construction of the Lord of the Rings? And then I thought, well, what did he read just in general of modern literature? And I started looking at all the different possible sources. I looked at the letters, at references in letters. I looked at the biography. I looked then at interviews with Tolkien, interviews with people who knew him, his family, his friends, his students, his colleagues. And over 10 years of tracking these things down, and looking also at drafts of his writing, at newly published collections, the massive History of Middle-earth collection, I realized that from here and there and here and there, the references to modern literature, and by modern, I mean post 1850, so modern for Tolkien, they kept piling up and piling up. And that it was very clear that he was taking this literature seriously. He was engaging with it. He had thoughts, he had views, and he disliked some of it, but he really liked other parts of it. And his reactions were by no means what you would predict based on the stereotype of him being stuck in the past. And I realized that Humphrey Carpenter's statement, he read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it, was simply factually incorrect. But it had put most everybody off the trail. And those scholars who had followed up on his modern reading had done so in a way that sort of assumed it was an exception to the rule. And what I realized is that this rule just needed to be chucked out into the rubbish heap, because there is no rule. So Tolkien's modern reading is an exploration of my findings, looking only at what I can show with evidence that he actually had read. So I don't touch on what he might have read or probably read or books that are thematically connected. No. Only the actual hard evidence. And that gave me over 150, about 150 authors, more than 200 works that I can show that he read. So slightly under 150 authors, more than 200 works. And that's quite That's quite a wide sampling. Everything from George MacDonald to James Joyce that he engaged with, lots of authors we've never even heard of, but who were very important to him. And so that meant going back, looking at the context and actually reading these books, not just noting the name, but reading them. Sometimes books that I had to get, through dusty old archives and used bookshops because they've been totally forgotten. And I found that it really transformed my picture of who Tolkien is and showed that he's a much more widely read, much more well-rounded figure. He had much more nuanced views on things like technology and modernity than people who gave him credit for. And also when it comes to his engagement as a Christian, I also found that he read very widely in authors who disagreed with him quite profoundly, and that he respected their work and he was willing to admire the work while disagreeing with the view. And also that when he came to his fellow Christians, he might, share their views, but challenge their work. And so it really, I think, gave a picture of him as a much more complex and frankly interesting figure, even than I had thought to begin with.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Well, look, let me remind you again, the book that shortly to be published by Holly is called Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And of course, Michael's book is the Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. Now, but before we go back to Michael, briefly, Holly, I just wanted to ask you what your view is on this whole idea of allegory versus parable that Michael draws out in his book. I always understood, not that I'm any, up to, a real scholar in this matter, but that Tolkien never really liked the kind of the overtness or relative overtness of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories. He felt that they were a bit too in your face as far as the Christian symbolism there. And in a way, I've always taken them to be, if you're talking about an allegory, that really is sort of a direct kind of transplanting Aslan for Jesus and the children for Adam and Eve and all the rest of it. So what's your view of how, firstly, Tolkien viewed, the way that Lewis used allegory, but secondly, what form of allegory, if you can call it that, was involved in his own work?
Well, here I do take a slightly different line of thought than Michael does on this, because I think we really need to be precise about what we mean by allegory. And we should remember that both Lewis and Tolkien were scholars of medieval literature, in which allegory is an important literary genre. And what they would have called and known as allegory, the literary genre, is not what either of them are doing. It's generically related, but it's not the same. And I think we can see this because both Lewis and Tolkien do use allegory. Lewis, for instance, in The Pilgrim's Regress, which is the first fictional book that he published after his conversion, that is a straight up allegory. Everything tracks, the story maps on to the meaning. The Chronicles of Narnia have allegorical elements like the crucifixion and resurrection, the Genesis story, but overall they're what Lewis calls a supposal. What if Jesus were as embodied in another world? And there is no direct connection between all of the points. It's one of the things that frustrated so many scholars in trying to figure out what the coherence was of the Chronicles of Narnia until my friend Michael Ward unpacked it with the planetary connection in Planet Narnia, which is not allegorical, it's thematic.
Yeah. And I suppose there's that, the fact is that obviously Lewis does connect those stories to our world. So in that sense, Aslan intends the children to understand they will meet him in another form in their world. Therefore, it's not typically what you would see as allegory in that sense. But yeah, keep going. And what about Tolkien as well?
Well, I say, and Tolkien himself does do some bits of allegory. For instance, his opening to his essay Beowulf and the Critics starts out with an allegory about Beowulf scholarship, of all things. And he writes his very last published story, Smith of Wotton Major, is largely allegorical. And we know this in part because Tolkien writes the key of the allegory to his friend Clyde Kilby. But in contrast to that, he's very clear that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. He's quite vehement. Now, he does, in some ways, I think, protest too much because he's trying to squelch people who were doing things like saying the one ring is the atom bomb. And he just had no patience with that. It was silly. It was ridiculous. He was trying to sort of stomp out American readers, sending him silly letters proposing that they had discovered the allegorical key of the novels. But there are elements of what he calls applicability. And certainly there are Christian thematic elements. I mean, he himself said in one of his letters that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing and consciously in the revision. And that is why, he says, that is why he cut out all of the overt religious references. So I think, and that particular passage in his letters has caused a lot of, head scratching and wrestling. What did he mean by that? And I think we have to take into account just the complexity of Tolkien's thinking. And that's certainly something I've come to grips with a lot more over the last few years. So I think that thinking about The Lord of the Rings as an allegory in the way that we as literary critics, we would talk about allegory, it's simply not. Not least because he starts out his story and he doesn't know where it's going. I mean, there are many instances in his letters and in the history of Middle Earth where he's sort of despairing. He's got them to Moria and doesn't know what happens next. Where does he go from here? And I think that's a big tip off that it's not an allegory in the straightforward sense. And I would argue not a parable in the straightforward sense, because there's no larger plan. Are there underlying themes? Absolutely, yes. Is there the overarching conscious plan? I would suggest no.
Well, we'll come back to you in just a moment, Michael. We're going to our first break. I'd be interested to hear your response to that. We're talking about JRR Tolkien, Jesus and the Lord of the Rings, looking at the Christian themes within Tolkien's books, and in the company of Holly Ordway and Michael Jahosky for today's Unbelievable show. Hope you can join us for part 2 very shortly.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
Welcome back to this week's edition of the show. We're talking about JRR Tolkien, Jesus and the Lord of the Rings. My guests are Michael Jahosky and Holly Ordway. Michael is the author of the recently published book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth, which argues that Tolkien intended his famous work as a parable of sorts, and we'll get more into that in just a moment's time. Holly Ordway is the author of the soon-to-be published Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle Earth, Beyond the Middle Ages. And just in that last section, as we start to dig into the content of your book, Holly was saying she doesn't think that allegory is quite the right word for what Tolkien, or indeed Lewis, perhaps were doing. And she also maybe contests parable. But so tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking on this, and particularly how you start to see these Christian themes being embodied in this way in his writings, Michael.
There's a lot here to unpack, so I'm inevitably going to overlook something. But I think there's no disagreement. I agree with Holly and everything that she said. So I'll try to differentiate what she's already stated. I think that what my findings have shown is that Tolkien was very suggestive. And what my findings have shown is that, this is more in keeping with a metaphorical mode rather than an allegorical mode. And one author I consulted on this, Gisela Kreglinger, has written an excellent book, I think, about George MacDonald, where she explores some of Tolkien's writings. And she argues that allegorical language is actually not really indirect. It's more direct, it's more explicit, it's more overt. And metaphorical language, which is often thought to be substitutionary, this for that, isn't. It's more suggestive. And she cites a number of scholars on this, from biblical scholarship as well. As fantasy scholarship. So what I have tried to argue is to say that the Lord of the Rings is a type of allegory. I'm differentiating it from the kind, as I'm well aware that both Lewis, which is often goes unknown, Lewis disliked allegory as well, and that Tolkien disliked. And so I'm not associating it with that. I'm associating it with a subset of allegory. So on the one end of the spectrum, we might imagine is what Tolkien, and I think letter 131, in that collection, he says is a conscious and intentional type of allegory. He did not set out to author one of those. But on the other end, you might say that there is a likeness between the New Testament parable and fairy story, which his good friend Robert Murray has already pointed out in an excellent essay and sermon that he gave. And that was where I started. And I was trying to unlock how, because, providing a concise definition of parable is impossible. Not everyone agrees. There isn't a consensus on it. It's not a earthly story with heavenly meanings, a moral story. It's not as simple as that. And so I think that what we need to unlock and dig deeper into is how truth is reflected in the novel. And it's clearer, I should say, in some areas that Tolkien is really alluding to Christian themes of exile and return, the biblical types like the king and bread and vines and trees and things like that make us think, as some scholars have pointed out, about the biblical story. And then in other places, it's much less direct. In fact, one scholar said that the allegorical correspondences in a good parable break down. And I think that's a great way to describe Tolkien's book, is that there's a certain point you're reading about the history of Numenor, and you're reading about the House of Durin, which is Thorin's people, the dwarves, and you're thinking, oh, this sounds just like the story of Israel in the Old Testament. And there are many points where I think the correspondences are quite clear. And then there are many points where if you try to go and engage in parallel mania, you're going to fall flat on your face. It's impossible. This does not equal that. And it's not quite like it is in the Bible, and Tolkien never intended it to be. Otherwise, he wouldn't further our knowledge of the Christian worldview. If he told us a story that we already know, he wouldn't, as a fairy story, he wouldn't be able to re-enchant and recover our appreciation of the Christian vision of reality. And to summarize, I would say, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Ollie.
And I think picking up on that word recovery is important, because it points us back to his great essay on fairy stories, where he articulates a lot of these visions. And so this puts me in mind of the fact that where he talks about the gospel as a fairy story. He says the greatest of all fairy stories. And it happened to also occur in history. And this was the great point that he made to C.S. Lewis and helped Lewis become Christian, is he helped Lewis to realize that the story of the Gospels was myth made fact. So for me, kind of what I'm hearing from you, Michael, is something that I would fundamentally agree with, which is the resonance of the Gospels for Tolkien is the big picture. I mean, he says on fairy stories that the incarnation is the eucatastrophe of all of creation, the good catastrophe, the happy ending. And this is what makes fairy stories move us, is that they have this happy ending. So the incarnation is the eucatastrophe of human history, and the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. And so it's that movement that cosmically, history has a happy ending because of the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, which Tolkien, as a faithful Christian, believed, devoutly had really happened. So I think fundamentally for Tolkien, the happy ending that comes through sorrow and sadness, which we get in The Lord of the Rings par excellence, is fundamentally theological in how it moves us. Because in responding to, Frodo and Sam being rescued, and that section of the Field of Cormallen where Sam wakes up and says, is everything sad coming untrue? That is profoundly rooted in the world of the story. It's something that happens to Sam and Frodo and Middle Earth. It doesn't happen to them as allegories. It happens to them as characters. But why does it move us? It moves us because Tolkien, I think, would argue, and I would agree, that it's rooted in the fact that we ourselves are caught up in a great sad story that will come untrue. And I think that's where we get the theological resonance. And I think that kind of structure is where we can start to understand what he means by a fundamentally religious and Catholic story.
Certainly.
I was just fascinated by something you said earlier, though, Holly, which is that you said he actually removed more overt religious references from the book at some point. Why was that specifically?
Well, this is something that I talk about a bit, explore a bit in my book, in Tolkien's Modern Reading, because it's quite, in a way, it's quite mysterious. And what we see with the removal of elements is, if you think about it, in Middle Earth, there is no religious worship. They don't pray. There's their brief moments of silence when Faramir brings them to the hidden outpost. But there's references, to the Valar, who are the archangels. So there's very veiled references, but there's no no overt reference even to God as the creator, even though Tolkien is very clear that Eru, the one, is the one creator God, but he strips that out of Middle-earth. And that's one of the questions that I brought to looking at comparing his work to Lewis and that of Charles Williams. And it's interesting to note that while Tolkien was not particularly enthusiastic about the overt theological elements in Narnia, he felt they were a bit too overt. He was very enthusiastic about another one of Lewis's theological works, theological fictions, which was Out of the Silent Planet, which he thought was marvelous. He helped to get it published. He was very enthusiastic about it. And he loved Perelandra, which is in effect a retelling of the fall on Venus. So we can see that Tolkien did not have an issue with the idea of using fiction to explore theological themes. He just wanted it to be understated. And looking, for instance, at Charles Williams, another inkling, Williams does it very overtly. And Tolkien didn't particularly care for that approach.
That's interesting to hear. I mean, coming back to you, Michael, I wanted to ask about this, but I mean, I don't read The Lord of the Rings as in any sense an evangelistic book. Now, obviously, many readers of Narnia stories completely miss their religious sort of symbolism as well, as I'm guessing, you know, Holly did initially. But they are more overt in the sense that I feel like Lewis had more of a sort of an agenda, let's say, at play in those stories. I mean, was there an agenda of a sort of, I want my readers to somehow imbibe the Christian story going on when you think, you know, when Tolkien started writing The Lord of the Rings?
I think in true parabolic fashion, the answer is yes and no. I think there are several comments taken at face value in his letters that say, you know, he says, I have deliberately created a story out of certain religious ideas. And elsewhere, as Holly's already said, it's a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Elsewhere, he says, I was fascinated with exemplifying moral and religious truth, you know, through the, ancient devices, which I think may have been a reference to the parable, but it's a purely speculative. Basically, I think the answer is yes and no. There is clearly some intention. The word deliberately kind of cues us off to that. However, the no part is what Holly's been talking about. I think another reason, just to build on what she said, is why they have taken, why Tolkien took these overt elements out, if he found any, was because it wasn't in keeping with the art of the parable. And that's what his friend Murray writes about. And he says, and I quote something to this extent in the book, Murray says of Tolkien that Tolkien wove allegory or allegorical components, or the allegorical mode is probably a more correct way to say it, into the writing with a delicacy that is just really hard to resist. And he baited it like a string of hooks. He says something to that extent. And it's hard sometimes to see them. And that's the point. And he did this, I think, looking back in the revision, as he says in his letters, he looked back and reflected on all this. And I think a final key as to why he removed this and why he wanted to be more understated, more elusive and suggestive and implicit, and all these words kind of mean the same thing, is in the debate of Finrod and Andreth, is a essay he probably wrote. It's in volume 10 of the History of Middle-earth, Morgoth's Ring, and that's just a gigantic series, as Holly said. He's written this in, I think, the mid to late 1950s is what my research showed. And he, you know, was writing this after the completion of the Lord of the Rings, or at least finishing it. And I think it's a meditation, as Bradley Berzer has pointed out in one of his books, on the mythology, on the works, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, The Lord of the Rings. And there's very much an incarnational theme to the debate text, which invites us to take the Luke 24 perspective, to look from Aragorn's point of view as a coronated king at the end of the novel, and look back on the history of Middle-earth. And I think this removal of allegorical elements too might have been not only in keeping with the art of the parable, but just a wonderful way to invite readers to explore the mythology and the very much a real place of Middle-earth, to look back at these other books. And he says in a letter, he says, part, I think, of the appeal of The Lord of the Rings is the glimpses in the background that I give my reader. And he spells that out pretty clearly. So I think that's wonderful. It's a yes and no, I think.
Yes. I suppose when Jesus told parables, he didn't tell them to be immediately understood. In fact,
No.
his disciples often asked him afterwards, what on earth was that about then?
Yes, exactly.
And so there's a sense in which, yes, that it's not meant to be explicit in a parable.
No.
But I suppose, we are at some level meant to understand it. I mean, who then goes and unweaves the parable? Is Tolkien kind of sort of expecting his readers to maybe go and make the connections themselves with the larger Christian story ultimately, but he's not sort of
carefully.
He's not sort of, forcing them to.
No, and I think that's another key. Exactly, Justin. I think scholars that have written about Jesus's parables, and I don't agree with his views, all of them, but John Dominic Crossan was, and I've actually bumped into him once and met him, so it was kind of a geek out moment for me, but I really appreciated his work on parables, and he writes about it that way. Jesus avoided a lot of the explicit God talk for that reason, and basically, yeah, you've already said it. I mean, it's Crossan puts it like, Jesus submitted the destiny of the meaning of the parable to his audience, and it wasn't always that you're going to get the right answer about the meaning of the story. And in fact, Tolkien, as Holly pointed out, took issue with many of the interpretations, very bad ones, I might add, allegorical interpretations of the Lord of the Rings, and said, no, this isn't what it is about, but it is an allegory, just not about this. And anyway, I could go on from there, but I want to be
well. I mean, Holly, any thoughts firstly on that? And I'd love you to maybe pull out what you think are some of the key Christian themes, if you could almost tell us, within the books and stories themselves, what you think shine most strongly as specifically relating to where you could see images of Christ or full redemption and so on going on in the books.
Well, I mean, it's easy to pull out some specific images, but I think what is most significant for Tolkien are the deeper themes. At one point, when he was reflecting on what is Lord of the Rings about, he summed it as being about death and the desire for deathlessness. That's how Tolkien himself summed up the theme of the Lord of the Rings. And that isn't quite like saying that it's about God or about the faith, but yet it points toward it because, again, as a faithful Christian, his understanding about death and deathlessness is rooted in, who we are as creatures, who God is, the redemption. So I think, sometimes I think we can do a bit of an injustice to Tolkien's thought by treating the Lord of the Rings as kind of a compendium of everything. But there's certain themes that he explores there, others that he explores in other works. So I think death and desire of deathlessness in the Lord of the Rings, and a couple other themes that I think are significant, and I explore this a bit more in Tolkien's modern reading, are pity and mercy. And this is a theme that runs all the way through the Lord of the Rings, where we have Gollum, who doesn't deserve mercy, but receives it first from Bilbo, then from Frodo, then from Sam, and ultimately it's because of those acts of mercy based on pity that Middle-earth is saved, because Frodo, and it's important to note, and Tolkien was quite irritated in a way that people didn't see this, Frodo fails in the quest. And to Tolkien, he writes somewhere that this is an exploration of that passage in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. Frodo was brought beyond the limits of his capability. He broke, but he had done everything that he could to within his capability. So he's therefore forgiven. He achieves the quest despite failing, but he achieves it because of his acts of pity and mercy towards the wretch Gollum. And these are profoundly Christian themes. And Tolkien, being well versed in the literature of the North and the Norse sagas, pity and mercy are not themes that are necessarily particularly evident at all in pagan literature. So here again, we have a profoundly Christian element that we might not even notice because we take it for granted. Oh, of course, it's a good thing. Well, it's really a shocking new thing that Christianity brings, is the value of pity. And so the whole story of the Lord of the Rings is an embodiment. You might even potentially say it's a parable about pity and mercy.
Yeah, you look like you're nodding away in agreement there to that, Michael.
I am. I'm just. I love conversations about Tolkien, so I get into it. Yes, I agree. I just wanted to add one thing to what Holly already said. Tolkien elsewhere in one of his letters says that The Lord of the Rings is a story, among other things, about God and his sole right to divine honor and tyranny against kingship, which I by no means, and I say this in my book, am reducing The Lord of the Rings or the Bible or the Gospels or all of the above to just this theme. But I think it's a very, I haven't quite put my finger on why, but Peter Creft has done a beautiful job of wording this. But I don't know why that theme moves us, but it just does. And Holly picked up on this, and she does in her book, the Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, about the story's ability to help move us and stir our emotions. But Peter Creft wrote in his own book about Tolkien that, we don't have kings in America. We don't have them, but we want them. And there's something in our subconscious, like an Arthur that's asleep, that yearns to be awoken from slumber. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but I'm just nodding in agreement when I'm reading this, saying, yes, I don't know why, but yeah. Pairing that with what Tolkien says here, that's what really excited me about writing the book.
You said it was N.T. Wright's work especially that kind of turned the lights on with the kind of, obviously the way that you saw that reflected in Tolkien's work, particularly, I suppose what Wright in the Protestant tradition has brought back into focus, which is the idea of God as king, and through Jesus, this kingdom being inaugurated. And you obviously see Aragorn, the kind of the rightful king in the Lord of the Rings series, as somehow embodying that. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit more? Because when you said that, I thought, okay, well, you see, the Christ figure that I've always had in my brain, though, as I say, not that I know nearly as much, has always been Gandalf, because he's the one who died and came back, basically. Yes. So that's always been, I've always assumed, well, if there's a Christ figure, but you're actually saying, no, Aragorn is more the Christ figure.
Well, I'm saying, again, in parabolic, ambiguous fashion, yes and no. I think it's both. And as several excellent Tolkien scholars have already pointed out, the idea, and I think this is from Hebrews and elsewhere in the Bible, the systematic, theologians have pointed out that there's a threefold office of Christ. There's the king, the prophet, and the priest. And the way I remember encountering it in several books that are in my bibliography is that Tolkien, consciously or unconsciously, divided these offices between Aragorn, king, prophet, Gandalf, and priest, high priest, which I'm thinking of the letter to Hebrews most prominently here for that one, for Frodo. And I'm just focusing on the office of king. Phil Ryken has written a book, The Messiah Comes to Middle-earth, which was also a great one, where he explores this a little bit more. And so if you're interested, he talks a little bit about it. Yes, obviously Gandalf. And I think there are some there in that Gandalf thing you alluded to about his death and resurrection, some more clearly allegorical, but not all the way. It breaks down at a certain point, references to Christ. And just before you think, okay, he's it, that's the Christ figure, you're scratching your head again. And I think, as Heiser in my interview with him, he said it in a way that just appealed, God or Tolkien puts something on the table, then he takes it away. He puts it on the table and he takes it away. And that's like a hide and seek game that I think Tolkien plays.
He refuses to make it, as you say, too overt.
Yes, exactly.
What do you make of all this, Holly? Do you think the references are as strong as some would like them to be? I suppose the reality is a lot of Christians would love it if Lord of the Rings was just a brilliant, depiction of the gospel, and we could just point it all to all the fans out there who don't believe and say, see, you were reading Christianity all along or something.
I do think we need to resist this sort of making it into a gospel tract, because it does violence to the book that it is. And it wouldn't be as powerful as it is if it were reducible in that way. But that said, I think that Michael's right. Those images of Gandalf and of Aragorn and Frodo are Christ images. To that, I would add that both Frodo and Sam are Christ figures, as Christ, the suffering servant, and also as Christ on the road to Calvary, because as they go up Mount Doom carrying the ring, that's very much, Christ falling under the weight of the cross on the way to crucifixion. That's again a very clear, I think, Christ image. Again, naturally coming out of the story. It's not imposed upon the story. It's coming out of it. And I think this has to do again with, Tolkien has a very integrated spirituality. So he's not reading these images from outside and imposing them on the text. It's that we are all called to imitate Christ, right? And so, we can see, like, in what way are we called to suffer and bear the cross? In what way, do we see people taking up the mantle of healing? Because the image of the Christ, the King, is a healer. And I think that's an interesting bit. We see that in Aragorn, that he has the hands of a healer, as we see when he goes to Gondor. So I think these are very natural reflections of the Christ figure, refracted, I would say, throughout Middle Earth. So it's not that there's any one figure who is the Christ figure. It's that we see glimpses of them in all sorts of places, which I think makes it more deeply Christian in a very real sense, because we can't just point to it and say, "Oh, well, I figured it out." It's like, well, Christ is in all sorts of places.
I mean,
I agree.
Arguably, could you say it would have been difficult for Tolkien to write a book that was not, in a sense, imbued with that worldview, because that was sort of the imagination which he wrote out of, in a sense? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would, and I think truly that is the key to understanding both him and Lewis. And I think maybe possibly more for understanding Tolkien, because he chooses to do it in an understated way. Everything that he writes is rooted in his faith. He can't not do that, because he is a thoroughly devout, lifetime committed Christian. It comes out of that naturally.
What before we go to our final break, I mean, I'd love to return to the kind of that well-known, well-worn story of Tolkien and Lewis, and Tolkien, as we know, very instrumental in Lewis's conversion to Christianity. But Lewis having this sort of question, having been relatively convinced of theism, still thinking, well, isn't the Christ story just another one of those myths that are really told in so many legends and fairy tales and other cultures? And Tolkien obviously saying, well, what if this is the true myth, the one where it came true and all the others are foreshadowings and so on of it? I mean, do you see then that even that everything that Lewis and Tolkien read in all of the mythologies that they were so familiar with, they really believed was, in that sense, coming out of this same story that they themselves were then imaginatively putting their own characters and people into? What's kind of going on in all that? But maybe Michael, you, and then we'll see what Holly has to say.
I mean, I think that it's very clear that the 1931 walk, on Addison's walk that they had, Tolkien and Lewis, I think it was 1931, is detectable in their writings. And this idea of the myth made fact has been pointed out by several scholars. And I think that, maybe I've misspoken at some point, but I really don't think it does violence to Tolkien's text to point this out, how the Christian vision of reality is being expressed here. I think that was part of something that Tolkien wanted to do. He wanted to do it in a very specific way that wouldn't do violence to either the gospel or to what he was trying to accomplish. And I think that's why he also included other religious types found in all of creation that point to Jesus, and similar types that we find in the Christian worldview, but in others as well. And that there aren't just Christian or biblical types in the Lord of the Rings. It's got a lot of different influences there. And I think that was him trying to express that Christianity can make sense of all other stories. And we can even do this in an imaginative world to make this point, as Jesus did with his short narrative fiction, to make that point that this is the true myth. The myth became fact that is, gathering up all the fragments of truth in these other stories and finding its completion in Christ.
We'll come back to you for more on that, Holly, in just a moment's time. But fascinating discussion here on JRR Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and the Christian imagery and themes that run through it. We're talking about that today on Unbelievable with Michael Jahosky and Holly Ordway. We'll be back for the final part in just a moment.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Really interesting discussion today on JRR Tolkien, the father of modern fantasy adventure writing. Talk about The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, other books as well, of course, that the true Tolkien fans will be very familiar with. How's it pronounced? Silmarillion? Is that the right way to pronounce it, Holly? I don't know if I'm doing justice to it there.
Yes, you are.
That was that published posthumously, I think, was it, the Silmarillion?
Yes, and really by Silmarillion, we can mean two different things. One is the posthumously published book that was edited by his son, Christopher Tolkien, to whom we owe so much. But also the Silmarillion is the entire, what we call the legendarium, that he worked on his entire adult life, of which the published Silmarillion is only a fraction.
Mm-hmm.
Holly Ordway and Michael Jahosky are my guests on today's show. Again, their books are available. The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth by Michael. I'll make sure there's a link to that from today's show. And also where you can pre-order Holly Ordway's soon-to-be-published book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. Just before we come back to talking about the myths, legends, and stories that Tolkien and Lewis were so familiar with, and the way it informed their writing and their Christian vision as well, Holly. You're allowed to be a snob now, but what do you think of modern fantasy writers? You know, the Game of Thrones type stuff, which in a way is relatively derivative of Tolkien. What do you think of sort of the modern incarnations of the genre he effectively birthed?
Well, it's fascinating because Tolkien had a tremendous impact on modern fantasy, and I would argue a tremendous negative impact because he's so good that he's like a black hole. Everyone is drawn into his gravitational pull. And what I think the major problem with modern fantasy is that, you know, if you look at fantasy before Tolkien, it's quite a lot more diverse than fantasy after Tolkien. And I think it's because most writers felt the need either to imitate him, and there's some ghastly stuff published in the 1970s in particular, but also when we get things like Game of Thrones, people trying to react against Tolkien. And, you know, just as Philip Pullman's Lyra series, his Dark Materials, is an explicit anti-Narnia, I would argue that Game of Thrones is an anti-Middle Earth. It's an attempt to kind of have the trappings of the Lord of the Rings, but with a totally different worldview underpinning it. So I think his influence on the genre is a fascinating subject. And The Lord of the Rings is, I would argue, the greatest book of the 20th century, but its impact on the genre is perhaps not all positive.
It was almost too successful for its own good in a way. That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, we were talking just with Michael before we went to the break about the way in which obviously their incredible, you know, wide reading, their knowledge of, you know, so much fantasy, folklore, mythology down the centuries. The way that informed the way that they then approached the Christian story, their own literature and so on, both Lewis and Tolkien. What for you should we learn from this today, I suppose, Holly? Do you think we need a bit more of the breadth, I suppose, that they understood and the way that they approached myth and story, Tolkien and Lewis?
Yes, I do. Because one of the things that we really must appreciate with Tolkien is indeed the depth and breadth of his reading. I think most readers already knew about the depth of his historical reading, that he was well familiar with medieval literature, with the sagas. What I've discovered is that he was also very familiar with modern literature and engaged with it thoroughly, reading all sorts of authors in very different genres that were not fantasy. They were all different styles and forms and philosophies. And I think both this chronological and generic and thematic variety is a big clue to the power of Tolkien's writing. That he wasn't just drawing on one stream. He was feeding from a whole variety of sources. The whole tree of tales has its roots really down deep in the mulch of the centuries and in the mulch of many different genres. And I think one of the biggest problems with contemporary Christian fantasy in particular is that they're all trying to be the next Tolkien or the next Lewis. But neither Lewis nor Tolkien were trying to be the next anybody. They were writing good stories, drawing on this massive corpus of style and tone and form and genre and subject. And if we look at that, I think one of the things we can take away is to say, we need, as writers, to be also reading widely different genres, even ones we don't agree with, different styles, different forms, chronologically deep, generically broad. And that will give us, I think, more power than what we've currently got in Christian fantasy in particular.
Yeah. What's your feeling of the sort of apologetic power potentially in what you see in Tolkien and the way that it embodies these Christian themes, which inevitably have to be, dug out? It's not going to be immediately obvious. But what for you is the sort of the potential, if you like, for how this could impact someone?
I think it's really wonderful as a sort of invitation. It allows us to explore these themes and to talk about them in a space that's safe. We're not being, proselytized. We're able to explore good and evil and pity and mercy and death. And I think in that sense, we have to be careful not to try to use the Lord of the Rings. My hackles go up when someone tells me, how can I use the Lord of the Rings for evangelism? And my answer is, you don't, you shouldn't. It's not a tool to be used. It's a story to be experienced. And I think if we keep that in mind, that it's a story that we experience together, and then we can talk about the themes, we can talk about the insights, but we must realize that it's a living story. It's a creative work. As soon as we try to make it into an evangelistic tool, it loses its power and it becomes flat. The life comes from it being a story that we enter into.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Michael?
Oh, most certainly. In his essay on Beowulf, Tolkien says exactly that. A myth is alive in all of its parts. Once you dissect it, it dies. So you can't, you really can't use it. I was asked on a couple of interviews, how would you do it? And I have answers to that. I agree with Holly. I think that the usefulness, and I know that's not a good word, there's a better word, the power of the Lord of the Rings is as a mythos, as a story. And then after you've read it some more and read it again, and maybe read the other books, I think a book like mine is one for looking back on it and pulling from that, why is it affecting me? And that was my journey in writing this book, is I wanted to understand how it was expressing that sacramental vision of reality. So I think it's something that is more of a late stage thing you do, but I agree that you shouldn't be wielding it like a tool. And I think far too many apologists are doing that today. And even some that had asked me about it, I think it was so much so that, oh, well, how can we say this at the next, meeting with, some skeptics about how to drop a portion of the book and, can it point to the moral argument? I'm like, you could do that. There are moments I think you could, but should you? No. And Lewis in his Myth Became Fact essay says something like this too. You've got to experience the myth as a concrete experience. That's what it is. And you have to taste it, and you're invited into it. You have to participate in it. And once you are, and then you look back and reflect on it, I think you'll find that it has massive apologetic potential, but you should present it and commend it as a story first and foremost.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's, again, going back to Lewis, the Narnia stories, that their apologetic appeal was not because they did a great job at explaining the Christian story in this metaphorical, supposal way. It was more that you wanted it to be true. You wanted that world to be true, exactly. which is not a sort of just a sort of rational intellectual approach. It's an imaginative approach, isn't it, Holly? I mean, is that what I guess, is that what the value potentially, if there is an apologetic value to Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and so on, it's that you want this vision of reality, of good, evil, and all that goes with it to be the true reality.
I would agree. I think that's probably the best way to sum it up, because one of the, I think, key points about apologetics and evangelism in general is that people need to care about something before they're interested in whether it's true or false. So that question of meaning is really fundamental. Until people care, they're not going to listen to our arguments about whether it's true or it's false. But if they can experience a vision of the world seen through Christian eyes, as we get in Narnia, as we get in Middle Earth, and it's beautiful and it's moving and it's compelling, and it brings them to the point of saying, could this be true? Then the arguments are not about finding the themes and dissecting them. It's about saying, this vision that so captured you, yes, it could be true. Here is how you can have confidence that, in fact, it is true. And that, I think, is the true, most effective way for works of literature like this to be part of the evangelizing process, is because they give this picture, so that we actually care whether the Christian, whether the resurrection happened or not. It's no longer just this sort of claim that people make, it happened, it didn't happen. It matters.
Yeah. And that's obviously your story, Holly. I mean, pretty much in a nutshell, you experienced the power of what those Christian writers and poets were saying in a way well before you kind of believed the doctrines. You wanted that vision of reality to somehow be true in your life as well.
Yeah, I was captivated by it. It was rich, it was meaningful, and so it made me want to find out more about it. It gave a purpose to the questions, because unless people ask the questions, our answers have no meaning for them. So in a sense, one of the values of something like The Lord of the Rings is that it helps people to ask questions like, does evil triumph? What's the value of pity and mercy? Things like that. And once people are asking the questions, then they're ready to hear the answers, but they need to ask the questions first.
Mm-hmm. Michael and Holly, it's been such a pleasure to spend some time with you today. Just again, a reminder that the books are from Michael Jahosky, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth, and from Holly, the forthcoming book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. Links to both of them from today's show. It's made me want to, in 2021, pick up my Tolkien again and give it a reread 20 years on from when I last read it. But thank you very much both for being with me on the show. It's been a real delight.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Justin, thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Justin. Pleasure.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.